You're listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Here are your hosts, Fran Chismar and Tom Kinezic.
Welcome back to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast presented by Pinelands Nursery. I am Fran Chismar.
And I'm Tom Kinezic, and welcome to episode 52. So we're still making progress.
Every week when you say that for the podcast, it still surprises me. Like it's almost to me, it's like a countdown as to when are they going to say, all right, that's enough. You guys are done.
Yeah. And this should be an interesting discussion too. I've mentioned a few times that I'm a country bumpkin. Don't enjoy going to the city most often, and a lot of times it's because there aren't a lot of plants. There's not a lot going on, but our guest today is trying to change that.
Well, you grew up in the country. You know, even though I grew up in the suburbs, and I grew up in a large suburb, my family was from Philadelphia, and they moved to the suburbs right before I was born. So we spent a lot of time in the city when I was a kid, and actually, whenever we would have family come in from out of town, which wasn't often, or friends, we would spend all of our time in the city. So I'm very, even though I've never lived in the city, I'm very comfortable with the city. I could be a city dweller. I couldn't. Although I do enjoy living in it. Like for where I live now, I'm in the country. That was an adjustment for me, and I enjoyed and appreciate it. I may be one of those people that says they can live in the city until they live in the city, and then
like I moved from where I had no neighbors to having one neighbor, and I don't like that.
Yeah, you know, my neighbors are really far away, and they could host a concert in their yards, and I wouldn't hear it. So I'm sure I would be the first person to complain if I were in a townhouse and I heard my neighbor's TV. I'd be like, "What is this? I can't take this." So, but anyway, yeah, I'm really excited about this episode. I love when we have on guests that we know and that we work with, and we don't get to do it often. So I'm always excited when it's a familiar face, and we're familiar with what we're going to talk about. So that's today. But before I forget, on the last episode during Saul's voicemail, because I always get so flustered with all the misinformation in those voicemails, and I lost my train of thought when he was talking about a calorie pear.
Which we did get a suggestion for a low calorie tree, and that was on one of our Facebook posts about the redbud, and how redbud flowers are edible and taste like sweet peas. And someone said, well, maybe that's your low calorie tree.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So, but what I was going to mention was, because it was a perfect tie-in, but I was so flustered if he's so worried about calories and health conscious, I was going to recommend Nutrition for Longevity, which was Jennifer Maynard, who was just on our soil episode. I had a chance to, I know you looked beforehand. I didn't look till afterwards. So a lot of farm to table meal choices that it's farm to your front door in 48 hours.
Yeah, something like that.
And a lot of pescatarian and vegan meal choices. Actually, it's all either vegan or pescatarian meal choices, but they look fabulous. Yeah. So if he was really concerned about how he was eating, maybe that's a great choice for him. But anyway, we should probably get back.
Yeah. So that's a good plug for them. I was really interested to see what they were doing, and then especially see that they're using native plants in a variety of ways. You don't normally think of conventional agriculture, and not that they're conventional agriculture, but agriculture and native plants going hand in hand. They should, but they don't always do that. And that was a scenario where they were.
And that's their whole philosophy, which I appreciate. And I'm willing, I think at some point we probably need to have Jennifer back on, maybe as a one-to-one, so we could discuss that more with her, because I'm interested in knowing more.
But on to today's guest. And if you didn't get my hints, resides in New York City and does a lot of his work in New York City. And as I mentioned, I'm always a place we'd go to Broadway, we'd go to places, but I didn't always love going to the city because I like being in nature, and that didn't seem to have a lot of nature. But maybe I'm wrong. That might not be the case. So today's guest is Jason Smith from NYRP,
New York Restoration
Partnership. And Jason, why don't you introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about what NYRP does?
Sure. So my name is Jason Smith again. I'm the director of Northern Manhattan Parks for New York Restoration Project. And real short, what we do is build, program, and care for green space in all 5 boroughs of New York City. And we really focus on trying to create accessible, well-managed green space in neighborhoods of need. So, there's some inequality in distribution and access to green space in the city. And so that's really core to our mission, is to try to do what we can to remedy that.
Awesome.
It's funny, I love hearing you guys talk about life in the city, because it's one of the reasons I always try to make it out to Pinelands to pick up whenever I can, because it's always hard to leave. I always try to grab lunch in town and sort of daydream about staying for a while.
And one of the things that with the pandemic that has spoiled me is that we're not super congested around here, but we can be, but it's even less. Like, you can go anywhere you want and not have to wait for anything and get space and get peace. And now that we're starting to come out of that a little bit, I'm like, oh, there's a little bit of a backup on the highway. I don't know that I like that. Like, I've gotten so spoiled that I don't know. That's why I'm thinking I wouldn't be able to live in the city.
Its life is profoundly different, but when it comes to nature, I mean, I think it continues to surprise everyone how diverse and abundant wildlife is in really dense cities.
Yeah.
And I'm particularly lucky to work in northern Manhattan. It's a really dense, busy part of the world, right? It's been a city for a long time, but we have these great chunks of parkland and kind of a unusual topography, and the wildlife is just incredibly abundant, and it's right on top of super busy neighborhood. So it really challenges ideas about, we tend to think about culture and nature as sort of opposites, and working in northern Manhattan, it kind of mixes that up in really interesting ways. We have little natural seeps that wash down cliffs right onto the sidewalk on one of the parks I manage, and you'll turn around and see a red-tailed hawk eating a squirrel on the corner. So it's a really cool place to work. And I think when it comes to plants, it's great also. I think in general the diversity, like on an urban rural gradient, just plant diversity, when you actually get to a city, it tends to be higher than rural ends. And part of that is all the exotics, but we also have a lot of natives left and a lot of interesting spots for restoration. Just requires kind of a different approach. So, I'd love to get into that if we have the opportunity as we talk today.
I would love that. When we had Dr. Enrique Sala on from National Geographic, one of the things that he mentioned was, and it was interesting, and he wrote about this in his book also, is that you don't think about it, but like New York City is an ecosystem. It may not be a completely natural ecosystem, but it is an ecosystem within itself. And if you were to abandon it, eventually it would become a natural eco. And he brought up Chernobyl as an example, how life continues even after that. It just is like, if everyone were to leave New York City tomorrow, eventually it should naturalize itself. Well, with the amount of I don't know that our even where we're at right now, that would naturalize itself if we were to walk away. But I love that concept. So
and it happens so quick. I mean, it would never be free of human influence, but even we work in a lot of sites that have been abandoned from former uses, and right away you see soil formation and successional dynamics happening, but they are different for sure. And I think even if people disappeared, it would be a different trajectory, but it would certainly become wild overnight. And that ecosystem idea is super important as well, because it sounds, when you say it, it sounds like a straightforward thing. Of course, it's a mix of organisms and a flow of materials and energy, but really we don't live like that, and we don't think about the city as an ecosystem. But if you really do, it really, I think it pushes you to think a little bit harder about how we interact with the ecosystem and how we guide it.
No, and you have to be creative. One of the, and Tom, you'll have to remind me in case I get it wrong. One of the more creative examples, is it Hunters Point?
Oh, Hunters Point South.
Where it was, they took an abandoned pier, recreated wetlands, but incorporated it, incorporated human interaction into that wetlands, which is important, because there's so little space for naturalization, I'm sure there's plenty of space, but it's less than what that we're accustomed to here, to incorporate people into it so that they can connect with nature and have that biophilia.
Yeah, and I think having that and kind of getting comfortable with that engineered component of restoration is an important part of kind of optimizing what we can do in the city. And then I think something to think about for, landscapers and land managers in rural settings is just, to a certain extent, the city is a little window into the future, because the urban heat island effect makes it a lot hotter. So we can kind of see, and population growth and just the physical sprawl and expansion of cities means, to a certain extent, we're going to continue to see urbanization of our wild and rural spaces. And it's not necessarily something we want to embrace, but to a certain extent, some of that's inevitable. And so we want to learn what we can from cities, and also do our best to figure out how to make them as diverse and healthy as possible.
I agree. I think for our listeners, it might be a good starting place to kind of rewind a little bit, just to talk about the history of NYRP and what led to the beginning. Like, you've been around 27 years now?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we were just celebrating our 25th anniversary, but that was 2 years ago.
Which is a great accomplishment, but it's still in the realm of organization, still in its infancy, kind of. Yeah. So what brought about the creation of NYRP?
Yeah, so for those who might not have heard of us, we were founded by Bette Midler, the entertainer, and it may seem like an unlikely match, but she's a really passionate environmentalist and gardener. And, the story that I've been told is she was driving her daughter to school on the West Side Highway in Manhattan. And at that point, some of the parks in New York City had been cleaned up from a real low point of kind of, a real deterioration of civic and public space in New York in the 70s and into the 80s, and there was a process of reclaiming that. But in northern Manhattan on the west side where she was driving, the parks were in really rough shape. The city just didn't have the resources, and so they were literally buried in garbage, and supposedly she pulled over to start picking up litter, and from what I know of Bette, I believe that's a true story. And she's a real force of nature, and so she just started talking to people about how this is not acceptable, and how do we start to deal with it. And so she founded New York Restoration Project, beginning to work on those parks on the west side of northern Manhattan. Okay. And we've really gotten into all kinds of things since then. But that core ethic of really saying, like, listen, our public space has to be top notch. It has to be healthy. It has to be cared for. It still kind of guides what we do. And Bette's like passion for really cutting through red tape and just demanding quality in the spaces that serve New York communities. That set of values still animates us, and that's part of what I really love about the company.
So where I first became aware of NYRP was during the Million Tree Initiative for New York City parks, which was it Mayor Bloomberg, was it 1 million trees in 10 years? And if I remember correctly, it was roughly 100,000 street trees, 900,000 plants for reforestation. And when I started at Pinelands, we were sending plants to places like Corona Park and Casino Park. And if I remember, that's like the Flushing Meadows area, if I'm correct, like the World's Fair type area. So and you were involved in that, or the organization was involved in that.
Yeah, so we were the major private partner in that initiative. So officially, we were responsible for 300,000 of those million trees. And so the initiative started in 2007. And I came on in 2008, so just as it was really getting up to swing. And so that was it was a huge project. It was great. We worked all over the city, planting street trees, planting cemeteries, expanding natural forests. It was really an effort to increase canopy as well as actual number of trees. And so yeah, it was a huge initiative. But it really transformed the city. You know, when you have a big goal like that on paper, I'm sure a lot of trees got planted that weren't the perfect tree in the perfect spot, but it really pushed the needle with canopy cover. My neighborhood where I live and work in Northern Manhattan has been transformed by it. You know, there are street trees on every block now. And it's a neighborhood that has high asthma rates and real public health issues that are impacted by having trees. So that was an incredible thing to be a part of. And I know other cities have attempted comparable projects. So that was really pushed us from the park cleanup into something pretty different.
You know, because when I thought about urban cities as far as being creative or pushing, you know, like back in the 90s, to me, it was Chicago was very much on the forefront with what they were doing. And this was, like, to me, like the major changing point, like when this happened, you know, because there was an understanding as we continue to grow, you know, with increased electricity and things like, we need to we need to have the natural resources to be able to expand, or we're not going to survive. So it was really, to me, a game changer when that happened. But what I just thought of, and I don't, you know, it's when you think, if you don't know New York City, or if you've never been to a city, you might easily think, well, where are you going to plant 1 million trees in a city? How many more trees do you think you could have planted over and above the 1 million trees?
That's a good, that's a good question, but I would say you could probably do 2 million. I mean, the thing is, it gets harder and harder. And so if you're talking about a street tree that requires, you know, being worked into the built infrastructure versus a sapling that's being done in forest restoration, it's very different. And they have different kind of impacts on the landscape. And so, you know, I think a lot in the first few years, we got a lot of the low hanging fruit, and it got harder, you know, so toward the end of our time, MRP moved from planting a lot on private property where it was more difficult for our city partners to plant, toward focusing on tree giveaways so that we could get homeowners to plant them on their property. And so, you know, the last few years, that was our emphasis. And so, you know, every property type kind of requires a different strategy, but just purely objectively, there is still room to expand the canopy within the city.
Do you find it challenging? I remember one time, this is probably going back about 15 years. I was at a conference in Washington, D.C., and that's a city that's really strapped as far as water usage goes, and their infrastructure. And they were trying to educate the city residents, and they were like, what they were learning were they were doing rain barrel giveaways, and no one was coming for the rain barrels, and they couldn't understand why. And then they realized that most of the constituents that were going to be using these took public transportation and had no way of actually building a rain barrel and taking it home. Like, do you find challenges like that as far as plant giveaways that you just?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
My first plant giveaway that I worked at, I remember people driving away in taxi cabs with oak trees, like, you know, poking out of the trunk. Or you'd have people come, you know, who lived in apartments and they wanted to get like a native deciduous tree as a house plant. And so, you know, there's definitely all kinds of barriers. And you know, we got a lot smarter over the years. And towards the end, we partnered with local organizations that had ties with the community where they were going to host a giveaway. So we'd work with botanical gardens, we'd work with public schools, and they would connect to homeowners or people who kind of understood the local issues, understood the property types. And so that was a way to make sure the trees really found good homes. And that was much more effective than just showing up, you know, with a bunch of trees on the side of the road. And, you know, I think it goes, it's a broader point about trying to manage the landscape, and whether we're talking about like a natural restoration project in a rural area or building a community garden. You know, we always kind of say we need to do community engagement and talk to the people that are using our projects, but you know, it has to be authentic, and a good way to do that is just to work with groups that already are in a given neighborhood, and know the site.
Have you seen a change in public awareness over the years since you've been there? Not just in who you are and what you do or what the city's trying to accomplish, but just as people realizing how important the natural resources are in their area, maybe trying to protect them a little bit more, or take care of them, or getting involved even.
That's a good question. I think there's like a baseline of interest that the communities we work with, I think people always want a beautiful spot. They always want access to green, and that really hasn't changed. And I think there's always been a kind of interest in native plants that hasn't fully been met yet, by the industry. But I would say the way people talk and think about it has changed a little bit over the time. There's been a couple big shifts over the years. Like Hurricane Sandy was a real turning point in how New Yorkers thought about climate change, and like everyone knew it was there, but we didn't deal with it in our day-to-day planning work and design work, and we didn't think so much about climate change when we planted a tree, and so that really turned things dramatically for the city. And then more recently, I think it's always been part of MORP's work, but all of a sudden this question of environmental justice, it was kind of on the side of a lot of conversations, and there was people who cared about the environment, and then there was people who, like, I need to get food on my plate, I need a job, I need, safety, and really they're connected, and we were saying that until we were blue in the face, but I think now everyone's kind of more broadly comfortable realizing, like, there is kind of systemic racism in access to green space, and air quality differs, depending on the economic levels and racial makeup of a neighborhood in the city. And so all those issues, I think, that's been the biggest recent turning point, I think, over the last couple of years is, and it's probably, again, it's less the communities we work with and more like policymakers and people who make, some decision makers they're all talking about environmental justice now, and they're all realizing that planting trees is critical infrastructure, and there's still a ways to go to value plants as much as we value concrete, but I think we're getting there.
I'm really torn when I think about urban environments because, obviously we work for a native plant nursery and we advocate restoration and native plants. But when you're dealing with a city ecosystem, it's not a natural ecosystem. And I know, I think I remember in the 90s when I was at Princeton Nurseries and working with New York City Parks, I want to say they were telling me the average span of a street tree in New York City was 7 years. I don't know if that's accurate or still correct today. I'm hoping that has changed. But I understand it's not a natural condition, it's an urban condition. So you need things that can adapt. So for as much as I would love to say it needs to be natives, I don't know that that's necessarily attainable because it's not a natural ecosystem that you're trying to support. So like I'm really torn when it comes to that. There's natural areas that should be naturalized, but when you get into the city, I understand cultivars that need to be urban tolerant now.
I feel I think it's a good question, and I think there's a real strong consensus amongst the people who manage designated natural areas. We're pretty strict about native plants and local genotypes, and to be honest, I think even those folks are going to have to start shifting more, right? Because we're going to have to start looking at southern genotypes. And then when it comes to working in the built environment or gardens, I don't think we should abandon natives. Although, to be honest, again, like the standard forester who's picking out a street tree, their palette includes a lot of non-native trees, and the proportion has shifted recently. It's much more native, but that's not the number one concern of urban arborists for the most part. And I actually think we can do both, right? We just need to get and people always say we can't go back to 400 years ago, but they still try to, right? We still have what I call like a restoration framework, really. And we know that the world's changed, but we we still have these target communities, right, of what would have been here before we built the city. And that's, and even for, again, even for wild and rural restoration, that's not really the way to think about it. And so I think for working in the city, we just have to think a little harder over, be a little more flexible with our definition of native, and expand that idea of how, like, move away from this idea of a target community that's based on a wild or rural thing or a historical community, and think much more about, like, all right, this is the climate, this is the soil conditions, totally different than what you would have had, and what's the right group of native plants here. And it might be in a novel community, but it can still do the work, right, that Doug Tallamy has shown native plants do in a suburban landscape. It can still support this diverse food web. And in fact, we can even, in the city, we can do real conservation work that, we have little kind of microenvironments that are different than rural wild spaces, where we can actually potentially do conservation work that's harder in a wild space. Like, many of our soils are excessively buffered with calcium, for example, from all the concrete and plaster. So where you have problems with acidification, impacting like sugar maple regeneration in rural forests in New York State, come to New York City, the sugar maples are really happy because there's tons of calcium in the soil. And so that's just one small example of how we just need to be more creative. And I think people get too discouraged and they think, all right, the city is hard. It's hard for a native plant. So I'm going to get this like all purpose, like, weedy tree. And that's the wrong way to think about it. We just need to be, if we do a little more homework about what the right native plant is, and maybe look further south, like some of my favorite native plants are actually, they're from pretty, like even from Texas, you can get plants that'll do well in the city.
Yeah.
And, particularly when we're talking about genotypes of native trees, like one of my colleagues has done work on, he does these heating experiments in Harvard Forest in Massachusetts, and the maple trees are not doing well in his experiments. But we know he's heating the soils to comparable temperatures to the southern range of sugar maples, where the trees do fine.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
So we just need to get a lot more ambitious about, assisted migration and novel communities, and how does that work with conservation?
Yeah.
And maybe stop talking about restoration. Sorry, that was a super long answer, but
do you mind talking a little bit more about that? I don't know how much you know about that study you were just talking about, but with the genotypes and testing out if you warm the soil on the northern.
Yeah.
Can you go into that a little bit more?
Sure.
That's pretty fascinating.
Well, the soil warming experiments, there's a bunch of different researchers have been doing that. The study I was talking about is by my colleague Andrew Reinman, and he works at the City University of New York now, and he's got some soil warming plots with sugar maples, and he's got some really interesting results. But another one of my colleagues is Rich Hallett at the Forest Service, and he's leading up a project he's calling the urban silviculture, I believe, and he's starting to introduce some really rigorous trials of southern genotypes in urban landscapes, and I think it would be fantastic if growers like you were in touch with Rich and the Forest Service, because if they start to identify appropriate genotypes for northeastern cities, we're going to need people to grow them.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to ask, is we get that question a lot. It's like, oh, well, if I want a tree that's going to grow 100 years from now, where should I be getting the seed source from? And well, I don't know.
And that's the difficult thing. I can imagine even just making the thing or the determination that, hey, we're going to plant natives in New York City. I'm sure there's plenty of challenges that we just discussed and many more that we haven't discussed. It's almost one of the things that we always talk about here is planting the right plant in the right place. And sometimes, historically things have changed. So maybe what was the right plant 100 years ago isn't the right plant today. You do have climate change. You do have that's going to progress. So maybe if historically sugar maples were there, maybe that would have changed naturally on its own, even if that hadn't, if the city hadn't gotten larger or any of those things. So that's where the lines get blurred for me. I don't know what the answer is.
It's complicated, and it really that's kind of the fun part, right? Though, because that means it's a scientific challenge, and it's also a design challenge.
Yeah.
And there's a role for people to say, well, this is the kind of forest we want. They're really, like, when we're talking about forests, they're really human driven things in the city, and forest succession is complicated anyway. And so it's like a lot of our forests were oak hickory forests, or before that they were chestnut oak hickory forests. Now if you walk around in them, it looks like they're becoming black cherry hackberry sassafras forest. And now that's probably like a successional community, and what that would move to is hard to say, but so a lot of it, I think, is actually looking at wild regeneration, and understanding, when you look at an urban forest plot, one of the things I love to do is I love to go in and remove the invasives, and then you're left with a really cool community of native trees. Like we see, I love getting hickories from you guys, because not that many people grow hickories.
Yeah.
But we also see, like, for some reason, hickories do really well regenerating. Our oaks are struggling a little more. But you see a pretty diverse native forest regenerating on its own, if you can kind of blunt the pressure of invasive. And so I think it's fair to say, like, is that natural? Is it not natural? And that's where maybe it doesn't matter. But what we're doing is we're conserving our natural history, we're conserving biodiversity, and we're making a beautiful forest. And so maybe you take that mix of wild plants and you start to introduce some late successional plants with southern genotypes, like a sugar maple from the southern end of its range, and you just hope that it's going to be all right, because you can't really predict this stuff. When a community of plants that's assembled over since the Ice Age starts to come apart, it's not an evenly northward march, right? Some plants are moving west as they respond to climate change, and the communities are kind of, they're reassembling it in a way that's not easy to predict. And so seeing that, like, that's, again, when people talk about cities being the future, we're seeing this kind of reassembly of plant communities, and that is an opportunity to learn a little bit about the future of our forests.
Is wildlife pressure something that is a factor for you? Do you have deer pressure? I don't, I know what it is for us here. I don't know what the deer situation is for you, or wildlife pressure.
It's probably the one good thing about gardening in Manhattan. I mean, aside from being in Manhattan, if you like it, is that there are no deer. Every now and then, deer will wander over a railroad bridge into the city, but they don't really. There's not much of a population. Okay. But the rest of the city has an emerging deer issue, and so that's it's starting to really impact our forests and our forest restoration. But it's still, I think, not as bad as suburban landscapes. And within Manhattan, there's a lot of folks, and myself included. I think the wildlife is actually incredibly abundant. And because we don't have all the same successional dynamics that you might have in an old mature forest, where you're at your climax and you have sugar maple or hemlock because it was the most shade tolerant. Oftentimes, more stochastic, or kind of more like whatever plant gets there is what you have. And so there's a pretty big impact from birds and squirrels. If they bury acorns you're going to get, or if they preferentially eat, I think they might like red oak acorns better. I forget which one, so they have impact, people are thinking. And then, of course, there's a lot of birds, and so they're one of the main ways invasives spread. So the squirrels and the birds have I think an outsized role in our forests for sure.
Yeah, I mean, technically, I guess you want to go with the prospect that if you build it, they will come, and you're building an ecosystem which includes wildlife. So, and hopefully, you have active birders and people like that start to appreciate that interaction and being part of that.
Another reason they have an outsized impact, like, yes, the wildlife is great, but they also, the levels can be intense because a lot of the wildlife populations will supplement their natural food sources with garbage, and so a lot of plants will maybe mast, and so that there's a kind of some controls on the levels of herbivory, but when all your critters can supplement their diet with our food, they can maintain higher levels, population levels. And so we see like tons of groundhogs in one of the parks I manage, and I love seeing them, but they do a number on little trees for sure.
Now, when you're increasing native plants and wildlife, like, I realize it's being done to help the ecosystem and the inhabitants of the city. Is education a large portion of your mission? I would imagine that not everyone understands what you're trying to do. That is technically or basically for them, for their own health and welfare.
Yeah, absolutely. And so education is definitely critical to what we do. And I manage 80 acres of parkland, which some days it seems like a lot, but when we're thinking about these questions, like how do we have a healthy landscape that is adapted to climate change, and especially if we think it's going well, we want to communicate that to people, and we want to make sure people understand that it's a resource. And so education is absolutely critical. And over the years we've had different approaches to education. When I first started, we had a boat building workshop right on the Harlem River, and we used to have a team of wildlife, environmental educators. Now we do a lot of it through partnerships, similar to the tree giveaways, where we work with local groups. Currently I've got a great partnership in Highbridge Park that we're working on piloting this summer. A team of graduate students from Columbia are planning on working with a local high school in Washington Heights. They're going to get some college students to be near peer mentors, and we're going to bring those high school students. They're actually going to get paid to do citizen science work in the park, looking at some of the ecosystem services of the landscapes we create. So there's like a huge array of people really eager to get in and take ownership over the spaces, whether we're talking about a small urban farm or a forest restoration project.
That's one of the things we've talked about on the podcast numerous times, is that it's great to do all these things, but you still need some sense of stewardship. Mm-hmm. So, is there a fair amount? I'm going to ask two questions. Is there a fair amount of volunteer throughout the community to be a part of this, and has that increased over the years? And just how many acres of land do you think you've had your hand in helping to restore since the beginning?
Yeah, and you definitely touch on an issue, right? And again, it gets back to what's unique about this work in the city is the ongoing stewardship is critical. And I feel very strongly that we don't value the people that care for the land enough. Sort of like we don't take good enough care of our teachers. We kind of treat like the groundskeeper not as much reverence as they deserve. It's too often like a guy with a weed whacker who doesn't know the difference between different types of grass, for sure. Yeah. So and that kind of the fact that we don't take a lot of investment in the people that care for the land, that the land kind of gives us back not a very sophisticated answer, right? Where you have pavement, astroturf, and concrete. But I think everyone naturally, like we all, I believe in the biophilia hypothesis, right? I think we all like to know the plants in our environment. And so it's I think it's a big project to really kind of build a culture that is a culture of stewardship, right? Where the paid workers are kind of taken better care of and allowed some autonomy to become more like gardeners,
Yeah.
And really learn about the plants they're working with. And then, and I think that's really critical. Like, I don't think that our public spaces should really be dependent on volunteers. I think we really need to pay for it and take it seriously. That said, there's a ton of interest in volunteering, and I think there always has. But it's a fair amount of work to engage volunteers well and to educate them and train them. So we suspended a lot of that programming through COVID, and just this week we relaunched kind of a regular weekly opportunity for people to come out to the parks we manage, and the goal is to get local folks who will come out every week and really start to learn about the landscape. And our hope is, like, we get 4 or 5 people, and that's really a big deal. It's like much better. It's great to have like a group of 30 Boy Scouts for an afternoon, and we get that. But I'm really interested in cultivating kind of long-term stewards who really want to learn about the land and kind of can become advocates for it as well.
So before we get too far into this, we talked about where NYRP started. We talked about that Million Trees NYC campaign, but I feel like we almost glossed over a little bit what you guys do now where you've gone in the last decade. I guess, when did that Million Trees wrap up? It's been a little while.
It's been a little while. And to add to that, like where you are now, just if you can share going back to some of the work that you've done, how it's fared over the years.
Sure.
Before we move on, one of the things I was thinking about with what we were just talking about, I wonder if anyone's ever done a study, like as an area gets restored in an urban environment, like if you see like less impact with litter, like if there was this much litter beforehand, like after the fact, do you see a change in how it's stewarded just without active?
I was just going to say, I think that I'm sure there are studies out there. Like it's a really burgeoning field of urban ecology and kind of looking at the interaction between human impact and how, and then the impact of greening. And the question of like, how well there was a bunch of questions there that we should get to, but the question of a few questions back of how well our projects do, I think that's really interesting, right? Because I would say they're never going to be 100% self-sufficient, and that's like a goal of the way restoration is traditionally defined as kind of a self-sustaining ecosystem. But what I find really interesting is that we can get really close. Even though when you think about how different the climate and the soils and the human impact is, there's and again, I've never seen the studies to really draw this out, but my experience is that there's a real meaningful threshold where we'll go in and kind of restore a site, plant native plants, and there will be like 2 or 3 years of really brutal invasive management. But then the native plants kind of knit together. Right. And we kind of let them do their thing. And we might have to come back and do an aggressive weeding once or twice a year, remove dump debris and the amount of investment needed really, it kind of drops pretty quickly. And so it's not like a totally steady state, but it's like how I define success. And that applies to our wetland projects, it applies to meadows, and it applies to forests. I think that same you kind of have this switch that gets flipped, and then it's sort of it's close to it's a lower input that's required.
I'm so glad you brought that up before we go back to where I was trying to go. Because one of the big misconceptions I hear all the time is a lot of people say, "Oh, okay, we're going to go in and plant all this stuff, and that's it. Then it's done." And that's not the case. That, like you said, you're going back. You're removing invasives, you're weeding, you're doing management. It's not a something where you go in and one time and it's fixed. It's And that's why a lot of these big projects we're not doing, we're growing the plants for, but the companies that are buying them, or the partnerships that are buying them, then they have like a 5-year monitoring plan that there is part of that whole bid process. It's not just, oh yeah, we're going to go plant all the plants and that's it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was glad you brought that up. So,
and I would just say, I think the monitoring is great. And right, it's usually got this kind of adaptive management framework that acknowledges that you're going to have to go in and tweak stuff. But I would say when we're dealing with like a human dominated ecosystem, even outside a city, our yardstick shouldn't be like we monitor it and hope it does okay. Like we got to compare it to, nothing else we do is maintenance free, right? If you're going to put in a lawn, you're going to mow it how many times, right? If you're going to put in a farm, so why would we think, if we're building green infrastructure, or if we're building a wetland in a human dominated system, it's going to require care, and most likely it's going to require a lot less care, right? But to think that you do it with zero care, that's just, I think that's not the right yardstick.
No, well, in anything in life, you graduate high school and 30 years down the road, it's not like you go, well, I did high school, that's all good, none of that changes, I don't need to reevaluate it or look at math changes, everything changes. You have to adapt and keep readjusting to what you've learned and continue to learn. It's not just, I did my learning, I'm done, all of that's good, it's stored away, and I'm okay. Like, and
even our pre New York City forests were managed by the Lenape people, and as were the shoreline, and so it definitely, it remains a persistent idea, though. I think that you have this kind of state of nature. But as far as NYRP, we had our roots in that, in just kind of going into these parks that had talk about wild. They were sort of like urban wilderness, abandoned cars. Highbridge Park, where I still work today, was a massive, it was like a factory for stolen cars that would just they were organized by parts and in these sort of invasive thickets. So it was really, profoundly neglected parks. And we got into the work of really going into these, pretty intense places where not that many people wanted to go. So it gave a real intensity to NYRP's work in parks. And the next big initiative was we purchased 52 community gardens I think it was in 99. In the Giuliani administration, there were a bunch of city properties that had become informal community gardens, and the city was going to sell them off for development. There was a big kind of political debate in the city, and NYRP and the Trust for Public Land got together and bought quite a few gardens, and NYRP inherited the 52 ones that were in the worst shape. And so over the years, we've been renovating them and activating them, and most of them are dedicated to urban agriculture now.
And how has that program fared? When you think of sustainability, there's nothing more sustainable than being able to grow your own food or take care of yourself that way. How has that program changed for you or grown for you?
It's there's been a real evolution over the years in community gardening in the city. It's gotten more and more established, more and more recognized, and over the past couple of years, a lot of people realized the depth of food insecurity in the city. A lot of it was exacerbated by COVID and the economic fallout, but a lot of it was there already. When I show up to work at the park I manage, a couple days a week, there are lines, many blocks long, of families lining up trying to get food from food donation pantries. And so that it's, there's a real deep need for food. And then there's also a deep need for healthy local food as well. And so, urban agriculture isn't the only solution, but it's a big part of it. And it's probably the number one emphasis of NYRP right now is to increase capacity for urban agriculture. And, that has an important piece to it of, kind of food sovereignty, where people can, we build beds and we build infrastructure and let people grow what they want and take ownership for producing their food, learn, create spaces for people to learn about it, spaces for people to decompress and garden. it's hugely valuable to the fabric of a neighborhood. And so, and one thing we've done over the years that I love is we brought in interesting designers. And so, NYRP tends to, we try to have everything we do be distinctive and special and well done, because a lot of times the communities we work in might not get as much care as they deserve. And so we'll generally take a chance and do a really creative, cool design. Walter Hood is a great landscape architect who's on our board, and he speaks really wonderfully about Black communities that are often given kind of these cookie cutter community gardens, and we really try to make them special places. And so it's a part of our work I'm not that involved in, but it's great, and we've done a lot of cool gardens.
One of the, I wish I could remember the name of the food bank, but it's in Massachusetts. And one of their things they always say is that if you want someone to get involved and make a change, you have to make sure they're fed. And because that's a main concern for anyone. So if they can sustainably be a part of their own food, that makes a change right then and there to make all the other things easy. To me, that's a starting point. But speaking of food, one thing that I would love to talk about, and we've never, in 52 episodes, we've never discussed this on the podcast, and it is an important part of a lot of tidal restorations, but we've never really talked about oysters, considering how important they are to our ecosystem. But I know you had, I think at Sherman Creek Park, a shoreline restoration that included a constructed oyster reef. So I wanted to talk about that because that's really, really important work that we never discuss. It kind of gets glossed over or put behind. And I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to come back on just to talk about oysters, because we talked about that all day.
We're going to have a great oyster summit, I think, at one point. Yeah.
You know what? That may be a good rooted discussion. So we could have the Haskins Shellfish Lab from Rutgers, someone from there. You can come on. I would love that.
I'm really interested in kelp farming now, which is kind of an interesting emerging field as well.
All right.
But before I get into oysters, you guys were talking a little bit about food production, and I think also, agroforestry is an interesting area where native plants and ecological restoration come together. I don't know if you know my buddy Dale Hendricks.
Oh yeah, of course.
He's really into growing pawpaws and stuff for agroforestry. He might be an interesting person to chat with. But
Dale, I've known Dale for a very long time. Yeah, he would be a great person.
The oysters are cool, and they're, it's funny, you wouldn't have thought they would be like the charismatic emblem of restoration, but they were a huge part of New York's history and its economy. And its ecosystem, and they were basically functionally extinct. There were oyster reefs all around the city, which were part of the system of wetlands and, eelgrass meadows. And there's a great group we work with, the Billion Oyster Project, that's been pretty aggressively developing curriculum to teach kids and nonprofits about oyster restoration. And we really got into it not because we wanted to start oysters, but because we were doing wetland restoration on a shoreline that had been on the Harlem River, was dredged as a shipping canal. And a lot of the shoreline is is riprap or bulkhead. So it's basically a hardened engineered shoreline. So we have a lot of boat traffic and a lot of wave energy. And so we were trying to restore the historic wetlands, and it wasn't working because of the wave energy, which actually, Bill Young worked with us on really kind of analyzing the site to figure out what was going wrong and what we needed to do to fix it. And he's the first one who turned us on to using reef technology as a wave attenuator. And so after many years of planning and, permitting and debating and designing, we were able to build an artificial oyster reef out of they're called Oyster Castles. And it's a really cool project where you can just stack them by hand or with volunteers. So we built an oyster reef on the shores of the Harlem River in northern Manhattan. And we did that to control not control, but to what we call attenuate the incoming waves, and that allows us to encourage sedimentation, turn around a shoreline that had been eroding, where we were losing wetlands quickly, to a site where we think our recent wetland planting will be able to actually grow, and theoretically it might accrete at a rate faster than sea level rise and help us build up the shoreline and kind of protect it into the future. So it's a great example of what we were talking about. It's is it natural restoration? I think probably, right? We're restoring ecosystem function and we're using native plants, but we're kind of engineering it for an environment that is a lot more has a lot more challenges than a normal wetland restoration.
No,
So the key is-
the energy, because that's an unnatural condition. So you have, I'm sure, hard bulkheads nearby that are changing wave energy and all of that you can't fix. It's not like you can go upstream or downstream and fix any of that. It's no longer natural. So you have to fight it with what you have to fight it with to make it as natural as you can.
And the simple solution is to just build a higher wall. But that's actually the more expensive solution, and it's also, it's not healthy. It cuts off access to the water. So I love this project because it's like a win-win, right? It's really showing what our shorelines can be like. Right now, you can walk down, and what's amazing is the oyster reef is covered with oysters. So we designed it for the wetlands, but last year was apparently a great year for oyster spat colonization in the estuary, and so the oysters are doing great. And on Friday, one of our partners, scientist Chester Zarna, is going to be introducing mussels into the wetlands in a kind of experimental design, so we can start to see how the mussels are going to do in our constructed wetland as well.
Now, if you don't mind me asking, I feel one of the concerns over oysters, at least over their use in New Jersey, has been some of these waterways aren't the cleanest waterways, and they were worried about people, if they put oysters out there, people then go and say, oh, I can go get all these oysters, and then eating them and getting sick because of the contaminants that were in the water. Is that a situation that you're seeing play out in New York City as well, or?
Luckily, the regulators have a slightly different take on it. I know some of my colleagues in New Jersey have complained about, I think that's a bigger hurdle for oyster restoration in Jersey. And, again, it may have to do a little bit in the city with the assumptions, like most people in the city are not going to assume that they're going to eat stuff from the Harlem River. So it's probably less of an issue. But, it's an issue. People fish from the Harlem, and I think you're allowed to. I think you're probably allowed to eat one or two a year. So I don't know that it's, and I think people eat a lot more. There are still PCBs in the sediment. The city has a combined sewer overflow system, so when it rains, raw sewage goes into the estuary. So the water quality has gotten a lot better since the Clean Air, Clean Water Act was passed. It's great, but yeah, you can eat the oysters. You probably are not going to be able to eat them in my lifetime.
But the whole hopes of that, I would imagine, is that they help improve water quality. So if
phenomenally.
Yeah. So if you get a big enough community over time, it will help combat that issue.
And I think if you stabilize, the PCBs, and there's some of those longer term things that are a little trickier. But yeah, I mean, what they do for water quality is phenomenal. And so if they're going to allow us to bring back swimming, fishing, boating, recreational uses of the river, and that all that requires is a bit of an educational campaign, like, hey, don't eat the oysters here. To me, that's like, for that to be a hurdle on something that's as powerful and effective. And to me, it gets to another big thing, which is just managing risk. And in urban situations, sometimes we don't do projects because we're worried a little bit about risk especially when we're talking about something new. Like some parks don't like community gardens and farms because they're worried there might be lead in the soil and kids might eat, so that there's issues around risk. But I think it's important that we don't, collectively, we don't let concerns about risk stop us from innovating, because that's how we get to a cleaner, healthier environment. So I'm a big advocate for oyster restoration.
And you can't assume either. We know that the city has gotten proactive in fixing some of those sewer overflows. What was the one in our catalog? Was it? I want to say it was either Bronx or Brooklyn, where they completely retrofitted the sewer overflows to fix it, and they put in creative wetlands, and they were saying the residents immediately noticed a difference just in the the odor of the neighborhood. Yeah. Oh, it was in Flushing, I think.
Oh yeah,
it was in Flushing, which made they just connected because of the
yeah.
So it was Flushing Bay.
Yep.
So we know the city is getting proactive as far as fixing these too. So you can't just assume that it's going to continue to have the same issues over time, that hopefully they improve as well.
Yeah, I mean, the CSO problem is a big environmental issue for the city, and green infrastructure has gone a long way to help, but we're not there yet. I think unfortunately we've got a ways to go, and I think ideally we control our runoff before it hits the estuary, but I think oysters are unfortunately going to have to be a big part of the solution for water quality, because we're still there's a lot of runoff. Nitrogen, globally, humans have one of our biggest impacts that we don't think about as much. We think a lot about the carbon cycle, but we've really messed up the nitrogen cycle. And so, all the nutrients in our waters it's just one of the biggest environmental problems. We talk about harmful algal blooms and fish kills, and that's all from excessive nutrient runoff into our waters. And oysters do a great job at binding some of that into the sediments and cleaning up the waters and removing excess sediment and stuff. So hopefully we'll see more of them. And if any regulators from New Jersey are listening, we haven't had anyone eating them.
Well, I would love to know, just over time, because I know it's a newly constructed oyster reef, just over time, the water quality, if, what the changes are in that area over time.
Now here's another question. Oh, you go, Jason, then I'll
I was just going to say, I don't think we'll probably have a measurable impact on water quality, right? Because it's so well mixed. But we are the same scientist who's installing mussels this week is doing he's doing a pretty thorough ecosystem services evaluation. So he's looking at sediment nutrient storage and kind of nutrient fluxes on site. So he's doing a really cool work to see, this kind of comprehensive wetland oyster restoration, what's it doing for nitrogen and phosphorus in particular on site, and are we able to enhance how are we able to clean air and water on site?
Yeah, very cool. So you mentioned that you were working with that Billion Oyster project, which I learned a little bit about, and I know they're doing a lot of stuff in New York City. I guess it's all in New York City, but is it going to be easier to plant 1 billion oysters, or was it easier to plant 1 million trees?
I'm definitely going to say it's easier to do 1 billion oysters. And partially is that because I'm not doing it. But, and to be honest, I think just like trees and oysters, it works way better if they plant themselves. I know you guys sell trees, so I think there's a great value in buying and planting trees, but it's also great just to let them regenerate. And luckily with the oysters, the same thing with the trees. It's about having the right landscape for them. And with oysters, there's been so much changes to our shoreline morphology. There's not necessarily all the right structure for them to latch onto. And so a lot of their work, I think, is about building the reef structure so that the oysters can colonize, rather than actually planting individually 1 billion of them.
Yeah, I mean, I know we love native plants, but they're only one piece of the puzzle. All these things, we always talk about balance. Oysters are important. That's one thing we've never talked about, but that's an important part of what we do, and we need to focus on the waters the same way we focus on the land.
And I mean, and ideally, right, part of the reason we think it's going to be a shoreline that's resilient to storms and sea level rise is the oyster reef is going to protect the wetlands. we're hoping, the mussels and the Spartina being interplanted will help the Spartina establish, and it, hopefully increase. There's some evidence it can increase the ability of the Spartina to sequester carbon and have like deep root growth if they're grown with mussels.
Even just for our shorelines, when you think of all the seawalls that have been put up and the hardscaping, the result in you hear all these, we had to bring in X many tons of sand to replenish the sand that is washed away. Well, that's a direct result. If you would think of the cost you would have saved if you would have restored your natural dunes and shorelines to attenuate that naturally, we wouldn't be having a lot of these. We created most of these issues, and you don't find out till after the fact most of the time.
Well, or we created them, or we created a system where we couldn't handle these issues anymore. You look at our Barrier Islands, just all across the coast of New Jersey and New York and Maryland and Delaware, wherever. Those were always shifting and moving, but then we put houses there and we couldn't allow them to shift and move. Like the Mississippi River has moved miles over even just humans being on North America, but then you put in residences and buildings and hardscaping. Well, now we can't let it move anymore. That's been more of the issue.
You need to find for a guest fluvial geomorphologist.
Oh, I was looking it up.
Just so you can just say it.
Yeah.
Is there one project over the years since you've been involved that you're most proud of that really just makes you like, I'm doing this for all the right reasons?
I mean, building this oyster reef was amazing, right? Especially last year, we had planned to have hundreds of volunteers come out, but it was middle of lockdown. The project was put on hold. I think we had to delay our order of plans from you guys. And then finally we got permission to do it. So we was just small groups of us lugging these blocks out with masts on into the river to build a reef. So that was huge. And to be able to do something this meaningful for climate change is huge. But I think my favorite project was we did a restoration of American chestnuts just up the slope from this oyster reef project. And we planted 200 hybrid chestnuts grown by the American Chestnut Foundation. So they were, they've been breeding them for over 30 years with disease-resistant trees. And so they call them potentially disease-resistant. And so, I think they're optimistic that this generation is going to fare well. And so this was like the largest disease-resistant planting done in any urban landscape.
Oh, wow.
And we did it, when I was talking about the parks we inherited, this was in the same spot where those chop shops were.
Okay.
Right. So this was a park that literally no one cared about. Like, I mean, the neglect was really profound, right? It's near a highway, it's near the Harlem River, which also people don't care about. So, to take that and not just say we're going to clean up the cars, but we're going to do something that's meaningful on conservation, that's actually going to help bring back a species that is on the brink of extinction. I can die happy having planted those trees and, hoping that some of them are going to make it, because it's a really cool tree. And it's just, to me, it's like, it's also an investment in the communities and saying like, in setting a high level of expectation for what's possible for neglected spaces in the city.
It's such a part of our heritage that our children don't even understand at this point because they've never known it. They don't know. And even it is beyond me, but at least I'm not far enough removed that I don't understand it. My kids have no idea and will never know. So hopefully I'd love, it sounds like I need to come up and visit and say hello and see this project.
Yeah. And I mean, you're not alone. I mean, none of us know what the chestnut forests were like, really. Yeah. I mean, I was trying to research the project and do like a literature review and kind of modern ecology was just being developed. The chestnuts were already gone. So the kind of information you have about most of our trees, we don't have about chestnuts. But we know, it was a critical part of colonial society and a critical part of our forest. And we always, it receives attention, but it's on the verge of being able to be restored. There's a new transgenic tree that is under a process of being potentially approved for use in the landscape. And so another example, I think, of how we want to get comfortable allowing some human influence on our wild spaces, because we're actually, we're losing so many trees to invasive problems and human caused problems. To be able to bring one back is a good thing.
Before we start to wrap up, I know we're getting close to the end of our time. You talked about how NYRP did some stuff in regards to environmental justice, and I don't want to gloss over that. So I want to just take a minute or two for you to talk about some of the things that you are doing in New York City in regards to environmental justice.
Sure, and the biggest single thing we do is our community gardens, throughout the city, which are open for the community to use for food production, and we try to allow those spaces to be governed by the local communities as they want, and then our investment in parks is targeted towards communities. Part of it's we have a long-term management agreement with the city, and the neighborhood has changed over the years, but that investment was targeted based on parks that had been really neglected and served communities that had, major health problems, because partially exacerbated by a lack of access to green space. And I think the big change isn't that work. It's just that people are comfortable acknowledging that, there is an aspect of racism and inequality in the distribution of resources that we can't get away from, and really just kind of admitting that, is a big shift. And the last project that I when I was talking about like the evolution of NYRP, we started in the parks, and then we bought these community gardens and renovated them. Then Million Trees kind of landed on us for about 8 years, and we finished a little early. But now our project that we really do that reaches all across the city is my favorite kind of thing. I think of it as much more sustainable, much more like human neighborhood scale. It's called Gardens for the City. So any community that might have like a schoolyard, an abandoned lot behind a church, a community center, they submit an application to us. We come in fairly quickly, cheaply, build raised beds, renovate the garden, just activate the space. And so, we've done 7 of them so far this spring. We've done about over 200, I think, since the program started.
Wow.
And so each one of those is a mini farm, a mini refuge, and it's great because so many people have this kind of top-down approach to restoration, and this is, or gardening, or whatever, urban renewal. This is basically like we're listening, and you come to us and say, I want this here, and then it solves that maintenance problem we were talking about, right? Because we're not building something, having a ribbon cutting and walking away. We're working with an existing group that is in theory going to be there to care for the space and use it. So to me, it's an example of NYRP getting smarter and more sensitive as we've matured as an organization, that we're able to really be responsive and do this project that's like, it's not generating as many headlines, but it's on the ground, creating and improving all these little gardens everywhere. So it's a really cool project. I think that directly speaks to a lot of, we target neighborhoods where it's really needed.
Jason, one thing I have to say is I love your passion for everything that we've talked about, and I'm curious about this for a lot of our guests. Is you're such a great representative of NYRP and the passion that you do, and I want to thank you for all the work that you do. But how did you find your way? You're such a good fit. How did you end up here?
It was a long and crooked road, like probably many people who wind up in horticulture.
Yeah.
My dad was a landscaper in Brooklyn, so I grew up kind of building small gardens and rooftop gardens. And I went on to actually become an art teacher and got a degree in art. But while I was doing that, I did a couple summers with the Nature Conservancy, doing habitat stewardship, and that was kind of a wake up call for me. I loved it. And it took me a long time, and I decided that ship had sailed, and unfortunately I didn't become a famous painter yet. And so I thought horticulture was maybe a way to go when I wound up back in New York City, where I was born, and never thought I would get into ecological restoration in the city. But finding my way to NYRP, I got more and more interested in the natural systems that we were caring for. Ended up going back to school for environmental science, and just find the kind of the challenge and potential of natural restoration in these dense urban neighborhoods is so huge that I just, that's where my energy for it comes from, because NYRP has built these like incredible projects that are beautiful and full of life, and I just want to see more of them.
When things are back to normal and we start having our customer appreciation events again, we'll have to make sure you're here, and we'll introduce you to Kelly Gill from the Xerces Society. If you don't know her, she was also another artist that found her way to the industry. She was saying her biggest flaw was if someone liked her work, she gave it away. That was
Yeah, well, I think as long as you're not trying to make a lot of money as an artist, that I think it's the better way to go, probably.
Yeah. So I know you're on a timeline, and we need to start wrapping this up. We always end with two things, and one of them being is, what is your favorite native plant? Do you have a favorite native plant, or can you name just one?
That's tough. I was gonna pick a genus, but
you can do that. We have no limitations on this.
I do really love. I'm gonna say, since I have to pick one, I'm gonna say swamp rose mallow.
Oh, very nice.
Particularly because you guys sell it. So that's my plug for Pinelands. But when we were talking about stuff that does well in the city, it's like we plant it along highways in ditches, and then it loves like the salt spray and poor drainage, and then you have this incredible blossom, and you think you're in the tropics, and it's just like it's an incredible trooper, and it's so unexpected. That's got to be one of my favorites.
That is a great choice. Yeah, and you're right. That's a plant that you see and you don't necessarily, you think it looks a little more tropical, but it's native to here, and you get that variation from seed, whether it's white or pink, and it has some salt tolerance, can take some permanent inundation, is very adaptable, and it's a very net. I stop every time I walk by one. That's a great one. So how can our listeners, if they want to support NYRP or get involved or volunteer, how can they do that?
So as I mentioned, if anyone wants to make their way to Northern Manhattan, we've got regular volunteer opportunities there. You can check us out on Instagram, Facebook, and if anyone wants to do like a small sustaining membership, a small contribution goes a long way for our organization. And nyrp.org, we have our newly redone website, so it's really easy to find out how to support us if you go to our website.
Awesome. On our website, we're going to share all of your social media links. Website, we're going to share. You have a fantastic video for the oyster restoration at Sherman Creek, is it? So,
yeah, Sherman Creek Park.
And we're going to make sure we share all that so our listeners will be able to see. We'll share it on social media, so everyone will be able to find you. We kind of always end this up with a final thought where you can you have the floor. We give you can use it for as long as you want. If you want to summarize, promote something, however you want to use it, the floor is yours.
We talked about so much, but I guess since I'm talking to you guys, I would just say thank you, for your work. We would, there's not that many people who grow good native plants, especially a lot of the upland plants can be a little hard to find. And so we really value that. And I would just say, if there's people in the industry listening, I hope we can continue to work together, pushing the needle on native plants, as we were starting to touch on, and thinking about how do we find kind of reliable, genetically diverse, but verified populations that work in urban settings, and we can start to really support conservation and healthy urban ecosystems by starting to kind of expand how we think about native plants, think about southern plants, and think about different communities, and kind of that work is going to, I think, have to be a collaboration between growers and regulators and designers and people who like plants. So
I agree. We're all in this together. Tom, do you want to go?
Yeah. So, and Jason, you even just led into my thought a little bit, because you referenced it earlier, how when safety is the first thing on everyone's mind, you don't really have a lot of progress and you don't take chances. And that's one of our newer coworkers has a phrase, safety third. And Mike Rowe even brings up how like safety first is like the terrible thing, because it makes you actually stop thinking about your own safety, because you think someone else is looking out for you. But he used this phrase, safety third, and it's basically all science and all progress is been by pushing safety aside and taking a little bit of risk. And we aren't going to make that progress unless we take a little bit of risk and try some new things. And know they might not work, but maybe they will.
And I'm all for safety third, but I also think a lot of the time it's also just like a realistic risk assessment.
Yeah.
And you know, as you can see in our political debates about like COVID, we don't always do a good job evaluating risk. And I think oddly enough, it actually affects our landscapes as well.
You know, for me, it's really simple. You know, I think when a lot of people think about nature, they think about the woods somewhere off in the distance, not around them. You know, nature is all around us, and it's in our cities, it's in our suburbs, it's in our countryside. So you have to think outside that box a little bit and what it means to all of us, because we, you know, in a lot of these places, it keeps diminishing as real estate becomes more valuable, especially in COVID. We see more warehouses, things like that. So really, it's not just protecting a forest somewhere, it's protecting every bit of open space we have around us, because it's important and it's diminishing. So just you know, it's something everyone needs to realize.
And realizing we can with a little bit of creativity, we can have it in our backyard, front yard, or our park.
Exactly.
Well, that wraps it up. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed listening to Jason Smith from the New York Restoration Project. For more information, visit nyrp.org or all the links at our website that we're going to put up there. You can find them there as well. Thank you, everyone listening to Native Plants, Healthy Planet, presented by Pinelands Nursery.
We're giving a huge thank you to the Egocentric Plastic Men for contributing our theme music. As things open up, they're going to be playing live again in the Philadelphia area, so we'll make sure we'll keep you up to date on that as they're out. You can follow us on Twitter at Pineland Nursery, Facebook at Pinelands Nursery NJ, Instagram at Pinelands Nursery, and YouTube at Pinelands Nursery. Don't forget about the question and comment line. You can call us at 215-346-6189. Ask a question, leave a comment. If we pick your question or comment, we'll play it and answer it on a future episode of The Buzz. And thank you to all the new members of the Native Plant Healthy Planet Facebook group. Thank you for contributing and becoming a member, and keep it going. Let's keep growing that community.
Yeah, we have a couple comments to reply to right after this. So
all right, awesome.
You can listen to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast directly at www.nativeplantshealthyplanet.com. You can also check us out at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, wherever you consume your podcasts. When you're there, please leave a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button, and leave us a little message if you can. It really goes a long way in spreading our message and making us feel better.
And we do try to respond, and that will come back to a listener shout out that we have in the upcoming episode of Buzz.
Yeah, with that, thanks everyone. I'm Tom.
And I am Fran. Thank you again, everyone. Jason, thank you so much. Coming up next, we have a Buzz episode, undetermined TBD. Undetermined topic. But that will be coming up next, and we'll see everyone next time. Until then, keep it native.
Thank you for listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Remember to like, share, follow, and comment.